Listen carefully, Trump. I built a youth movement that's crushing your generation across every nation, and from the blood of your failed empires rises young African fury you cannot escape. You thought our youth would crawl forever under your boots. You believed only white American masters could build anything on African soil. You thought young Africans would stay beaten and worthless while you hid behind guns. You were catastrophically wrong. I watched them build roads while your foreign experts only stole. I armed them with truth that buries your lies. This is your final warning, Burkina Faso rising. Your time isn't ending. Your time is already dead. Let me show you exactly how I discovered that old leaders were betraying young Africans and how this movement is spreading across the continent to create the Africa we deserve. I was meeting with university students in Ouagadougou when I realized something powerful. These young people were angry. They had studied hard. They had skills. They had energy. But they had no jobs. They had no future. They saw old politicians driving expensive cars while youth couldn't afford food. They watched ministers send their children to European schools while local schools had no books. They knew the system was rigged against them. I asked them a simple question: why do you accept this? They said they felt powerless. The old leaders controlled everything. The government, the army, the police, the money. Young people had nothing. They couldn't change anything. They were trapped. I told them they were wrong. Young people had the most important power: numbers. Burkina Faso had 12 million people. Over 7 million were under age 30. Young people were 58% of the population. If they organized together, they were unstoppable. The old leaders were only powerful because young people stayed divided and quiet. I explained how organizing worked. We would create youth councils in every village and neighborhood. Each council would elect leaders. The councils would meet weekly to discuss problems and solutions. They would coordinate actions. They would build power from the bottom up. When 7 million young people moved together, no force could stop them. The students were excited but scared. They asked, "Won't the government arrest us? Won't they use violence? Won't they end our movement?" I said, "Yes, they will try. But we will be too many and too organized. They can't arrest 7 million people. They can't stop a movement that includes their own children and soldiers." I started building the movement immediately. We held meetings in universities, schools, markets, and villages. We explained that old leaders had failed young people completely. We showed the numbers. Youth unemployment was 43%. That meant 3 million young people had no work. The government spent only $340 million on education for 4,500,000 students. That was $76 per student per year. Meanwhile, the president's office spent $89 million annually. One office spent more than a quarter of what all students received. The contrast was clear. Old leaders took care of themselves while neglecting youth. They stole money that should have built schools and created jobs. They betrayed the future for their present comfort. Young people had every right to be angry and every reason to organize. We created the National Youth Council with representatives from all regions. We established clear demands: jobs for youth, better schools, end to corruption, and young people in government. We set a deadline. The government had 6 months to meet our demands or face mass action. The old leaders ignored us. They thought we were just complaining students who would give up. They believed youth couldn't organize seriously. They were completely wrong. We spent those 6 months organizing everywhere. We recruited 890,000 active members across the country. We trained 12,000 organizers who led local councils. We raised money through small contributions. Members paid $2 monthly. With 890,000 members, that was $1.7 million monthly for organizing activities. We were financially independent. We also built connections with workers, farmers, and women's groups. We showed them that youth struggles were connected to their struggles. When youth had no jobs, families suffered. When schools were bad, communities were weak. When corruption thrived, everyone lost. We built a broad movement, not just youth alone. When the 6 months ended, the government had done nothing. We called for nationwide protests. On the chosen day, 2,300,000 people filled the streets in every city. It was the largest demonstration in Burkina Faso's history. The government was shocked. They hadn't believed we could mobilize so many. The protests continued for weeks. Young people occupied government buildings. They blocked roads. They shut down businesses owned by corrupt officials. The The country stopped functioning. The old leaders panicked. They tried violence first. Police attacked protesters with tear gas and batons, but the protesters were too many. For every one arrested, 10 more appeared. The police couldn't control millions of people. Some police were young themselves and refused to attack their own generation. They tried bribes next. Government officials offered youth leaders money and positions to stop the movement. We refused everything. We weren't fighting for personal gain. We were fighting for system change. No bribe could buy us. They tried propaganda. State media said we were foreign agents trying to harm the country. They claimed we were violent troublemakers. But young people knew the truth. They had experienced the government's failures personally. Propaganda couldn't erase their lived reality. Nothing worked. The movement was too strong, too organized, and too determined. After 47 days of protests, the government fell. The president resigned. The old system collapsed. Young people had won. But winning wasn't enough. We needed to build something new. We organized a national conference with representatives from all sectors. Young people were 60% of delegates. We wrote a new constitution. We designed new institutions. We created a government that served the people, not the elite. We established rules preventing old problems. Government officials could only serve 2 terms. They had to declare their wealth publicly. They couldn't have foreign bank accounts. They faced real punishment for corruption. We built accountability into the system. We also ensured young people had real power. The government had to include ministers under age 35. Parliament had to be at least 40% youth. Local councils had to have youth representatives. We weren't asking for inclusion. We were taking power. I became president because the movement trusted me. But I wasn't a traditional leader. I was 33 years old. I lived modestly. I took a salary of $24,000 annually when previous presidents took $4,500. I worked for the people, not for wealth. We immediately addressed youth unemployment. We created a national employment program funded with $6.7 billion annually. The program trained young people in useful skills: farming, construction, technology, healthcare. It placed them in jobs. Within 2 years, youth unemployment dropped from 43% to 28%. That was 450,000 young people who found work. We fixed education. We increased the education budget from $340 million to $890 million. We built 2,300 new classrooms. We hired 8,900 teachers. We provided free textbooks to all students. We made school actually work for young people. We ended corruption. We arrested 67 former officials who had stolen public money. We recovered $234 million they had hidden in foreign accounts. We used that money to build hospitals and roads. We showed that corruption had real consequences. The changes were dramatic and quick. Young people saw that organizing had worked. They had power. They had changed their country. They had built something better. But we also did something that shocked the old generation. We proved young Africans could build infrastructure themselves. Old leaders always said we needed foreign companies to build roads and bridges. They said Africans didn't have the skills. They were lying to justify giving contracts to their foreign friends who paid them bribes. I announced that young Burkinabe would build our roads. Old leaders laughed. They said it was impossible. They predicted failure. They wanted us to fail so they could say, "I told you so," and return to their corrupt system. We organized 23,000 young people into construction brigades. We trained them in road building, bridge construction, and engineering. We gave them equipment. We assigned them projects across the country. We told them, "Prove that young Africans can build Africa." They proved it magnificently. In 3 years, these young brigades built 1,200 kilometers of paved roads connecting villages to cities. They constructed 45 bridges over rivers. They repaired 340 kilometers of damaged highways. The quality was excellent. The cost was 40% less than foreign contractors charged. The speed was faster than anyone expected. The success was undeniable. Young Africans could build infrastructure. We didn't need foreign experts. We had the intelligence, the skills, and the determination. We just needed opportunity and support. The old leaders had denied us both to maintain their corrupt system of foreign contracts and kickbacks. We applied the same approach to other sectors. Young Burkinabe built schools. They constructed health clinics. They installed solar panels. They dug wells for clean water. They created irrigation systems for farms. They built everything our country needed. Each success proved that the old generation's excuses were lies. They had said Africans couldn't do these things. They were wrong. Africans could do everything. We just needed leaders who believed in us and gave us chances. The construction brigades became a source of pride. Young people who had been unemployed and hopeless now had skills and purpose. They earned good wages. They built their country. They proved their worth. The psychological transformation was as important as the physical infrastructure. Parents saw their children building roads and schools. They felt proud. They understood that the youth movement wasn't just protests and politics. It was about proving that young Africans were capable of everything. It was about reclaiming our dignity from a generation that had accepted inferiority. I also focused on proving young Africans could govern effectively. Old leaders said youth were too inexperienced and emotional to run governments. They said you needed decades of experience to make good decisions. They used this excuse to keep power forever while making terrible decisions that ruined our countries. I appointed young people to key positions. The Minister of Education was 29 years old. The Minister of Youth Employment was 31. The Minister of Infrastructure was 28. These young ministers were educated, energetic, and honest. They worked harder than the old ministers who had treated government positions as retirement jobs. The young ministers delivered results quickly. The education minister built those 2,300 classrooms in 18 months. The youth employment minister created those 450,000 jobs in 2 years. The infrastructure minister oversaw the road construction that exceeded all targets. They proved that youth weren't too inexperienced. They were more effective because they cared about results, not just staying in power. We also changed how government worked. Old ministers had spent their time in offices giving orders. Young ministers went to communities to understand problems directly. They listened to people. They tested solutions. They adjusted based on feedback. They governed with humility and effectiveness. The contrast was stark. Old government had been slow, corrupt, and disconnected. Young government was fast, honest, and responsive. People saw the difference in their daily lives. Services improved, problems got solved, government actually worked for citizens. Listen carefully, old African leaders. Remember when you thought young people would never organize against you? Remember when you believed your security forces would protect you forever? Remember when you assumed youth would accept poverty while you lived in luxury? I shattered every assumption. I organized 890,000 youth members. I mobilized 2,300,000 protesters. I removed your corrupt government. Your security failed. Your bribes failed. Your power is finished. But the most important impact was the inspiration. Young people across Africa were watching. They saw that youth in Burkina Faso had organized and won. They realized they could do the same in their countries. The movement started spreading. In Senegal, students created youth councils based on our model. They recruited 340,000 members in 8 months. They demanded education, reform, and job creation. The government was forced to negotiate. They won major concessions without even needing protests. The threat of organized youth was enough. The Senegalese youth also started their own construction brigades. They built 230 kilometers of roads in rural areas that government had neglected for decades. They proved that Senegalese youth could build their country just like Burkinabe youth had. The model was spreading. In Mali, young people organized against military rule. They used our tactics, mass protests, occupations, economic disruption. They brought 1,200,000 people into the streets. The military government couldn't maintain control. They agreed to elections and civilian rule. Youth power had defeated military power. Malian youth also demanded and won representation in government. The new constitution required 35% of parliament to be under age 35. Young people weren't just protesting from outside. They were taking power directly. They were governing their country. In Togo, the youth movement targeted the Gnassingbé family that had ruled for 58 years. Young people said enough was enough. They organized 890,000 members. They protested for months. International pressure built. The regime was forced to accept term limits. The dynasty was ending because youth demanded change. Togolese youth also created employment programs modeled on ours. They trained 45,000 young people in construction and manufacturing. They started cooperatives that created jobs. They weren't waiting for the old government to help them. They were building their own economic power. The pattern repeated across Africa. In Chad, Niger, Guinea, Cameroon, and Congo, youth movements were rising. They all studied the Burkina Faso model. They all organized councils, recruited members, and built power. They all challenged old leaders who had failed them. But they also added their own innovations. Chadian youth created mobile training programs that traveled to remote areas. Nigerian youth built solar-powered internet centers connecting rural communities. Ghanaian youth established seed banks helping farmers. Each movement adapted the model to their specific context. I supported these movements directly. We created the Pan-African Youth Network connecting movements in 54 countries. We shared organizing strategies. We provided training. We coordinated actions. When one country's youth protested, others showed solidarity. We were building continental youth power. The network held annual summits where young leaders met to learn and plan. The first summit in Ouagadougou had 450 participants from 18 countries. They shared experiences. They developed common demands. They committed to supporting each other. They left energized and connected. The second summit in Dakar had 890 participants from 54 countries. The growth showed the movement's expansion. Young leaders shared victories and lessons. They coordinated strategies for countries still under dictatorships. They planned continental campaigns for youth employment and education. We also created online platforms for communication. Young Africans used social media to share information, coordinate actions, and expose corruption. A video of police violence in one country would be seen by millions across the continent within hours. Governments couldn't hide their actions anymore. The technology was crucial. It allowed instant communication across borders. It enabled coordination of simultaneous protests in multiple countries. It spread successful tactics quickly. It built a sense of continental unity among youth who had previously felt isolated in their individual countries. The movement had clear characteristics that made it powerful. First, it was truly youth-led. We didn't have old politicians pretending to represent us. Young people made the decisions. Young people took the risks. Young people claimed the victories. This was crucial because previous African movements had been co-opted by older leaders who used youth energy but kept power for themselves. We learned from that history. We insisted on youth leadership at every level. We didn't trust anyone over 45 to lead our movement. Second, it was democratic internally. Leaders were elected by members. Decisions required majority votes. Money was managed transparently. No individual controlled the movement. This prevented the corruption that had ended previous movements. We published financial reports monthly showing every dollar received and spent. Members could see exactly where their contributions went. This transparency built trust. It also prevented leaders from stealing because everyone was watching. Third, it was financially independent. We funded ourselves through small member contributions, not foreign donors or wealthy patrons. With millions of members paying $2 monthly, we had enough money for organizing. Independence from outside funding meant independence in decision-making. Foreign donors always came with conditions. They wanted to control what we did and said. By funding ourselves, we answered only to our members. We could be radical. We could challenge Western interests. We were truly independent. Fourth, it was action-oriented. We didn't just talk and write reports. We organized protests, occupations, and strikes. We disrupted systems that oppressed us. We forced change through collective action, not polite requests. Old civil society groups had spent decades writing reports and holding conferences. Nothing changed. We took direct action. We made it impossible for governments to ignore us. We forced them to respond to our demands. Fifth, it was intersectional. We connected youth struggles to workers' struggles, women's struggles, and farmers' struggles. We built broad coalitions that were stronger than youth alone. We understood that all oppressed groups shared common enemies in corrupt elites. When we organized protests, we invited workers' unions, women's organizations, and farmers' associations. We showed how youth unemployment hurt families. We demonstrated how bad schools harmed communities. We built unity across different groups. These characteristics made the movement resilient and effective. Old leaders couldn't co-opt it because it was genuinely democratic. They couldn't buy it because it was financially independent. They couldn't ignore it because it took disruptive action. They couldn't divide it because it built broad coalitions. I studied why youth movements were rising now across Africa. The continent had the youngest population in the world. The median age was 19 years. That meant half of all Africans were teenagers or younger. This enormous youth population was educated, connected through technology, and aware of global possibilities. But they faced terrible conditions. Youth unemployment averaged 38% across Africa. That was 67 million young people without work. Education systems were failing. Healthcare was inadequate. Corruption was everywhere. Young people saw old leaders stealing while they suffered. The contradiction was unbearable. Young Africans had education and awareness, but no opportunities. They knew life could be better because they saw how people lived in other countries. They understood they were being robbed by corrupt leaders. They refused to accept this anymore. Technology amplified their power. Social media allowed instant communication and coordination. A protest call could reach millions in minutes. Young people could organize faster than governments could respond. They could expose corruption immediately. Technology leveled the playing field. The combination of large youth population, terrible conditions, global awareness, and technological tools created perfect conditions for youth movements. The only question was when they would organize, not if. Burkina Faso showed them how. Now it was spreading everywhere. But the movement faced serious challenges. Old leaders were fighting back. They were arresting youth leaders. They were banning protests. They were shutting down internet access. They were using violence. They were desperate to maintain power. In some countries, the repression was severe. In Cameroon, the government arrested 340 youth activists. In Chad, police killed 23 protesters. In Guinea, authorities banned all youth organizations. The old leaders were willing to use extreme violence to stop the movement, but repression often backfired. When governments arrested leaders, more people joined the movement in solidarity. When police killed protesters, anger grew stronger. When authorities banned organizations, they operated underground. Repression proved that old leaders feared youth power, which validated the movement's importance. We developed strategies to handle repression. We trained members in security practices. We created backup communication systems when governments shut down internet. We established legal support networks for arrested activists. We documented violence to expose it internationally. We prepared for repression instead of being surprised by it. The movement also faced internal challenges. Some members wanted to work within existing systems, others wanted complete revolution. Some focused on specific issues like jobs, others wanted total transformation. Managing these differences required skill and patience. We addressed disagreements through democratic processes. Members debated different approaches. They voted on strategies. They accepted majority decisions while respecting minority views. The democracy wasn't always smooth, but it kept the movement united enough to be effective. We also had debates about violence. Some members argued that governments only understood force. They wanted armed resistance. Others insisted on nonviolence. They believed moral authority was our greatest weapon. The debates were intense. I argued for strategic nonviolence. Violence would give governments excuse to crush us. It would lose us public support. It would play to their strength since they controlled armies. Nonviolence forced them to attack unarmed protesters, which exposed their brutality and built our support. The movement voted to maintain nonviolence as our primary strategy while reserving the right to self-defense. We wouldn't initiate violence, but we would protect ourselves if attacked. This position balanced moral authority with practical security. Money was another challenge. While small contributions provided independence, they weren't always enough for large campaigns. Members in poor areas struggled to pay even $2 monthly. We needed to build economic power alongside political power. We created youth cooperatives that generated income. Farming cooperatives produced food for sale. Manufacturing cooperatives made products for local markets. Service cooperatives provided skills like repairs and construction. The cooperatives employed members and generated funds for organizing. The cooperatives also demonstrated that young people could build alternative economies. We didn't need to beg for jobs from corrupt businesses. We could create our own work. We could build systems that served us. Economic independence supported political independence. In Burkina Faso, we established 450 youth cooperatives employing 34,000 young people. The cooperatives generated $2.3 million in annual revenue. They provided livelihoods while funding movement activities. They were economic and political institutions simultaneously. Training was essential. Most young people had never organized before. They needed to learn how to recruit members, run meetings, manage money, communicate effectively, and handle conflict. We created training programs teaching these skills. The training happened at multiple levels. Basic training for new members covered organizing fundamentals. Advanced training for leaders covered strategy and management. Specialized training covered specific skills like media, legal support, and security. We built capacity systematically. We established the Pan-African Youth Leadership Academy with campuses in 5 countries. The academy offered 3-month intensive programs training young organizers. It had trained 12,000 activists from 28 countries by 2025. These trained organizers returned home and built movements. We also learned from history. We studied successful movements, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the independence movements of the 1960 seconds, labor movements globally. We learned what worked and what failed. We avoided mistakes others had made. One key lesson was avoiding ethnic and religious divisions. Colonial powers had used these divisions to control Africa. Old leaders continued using them to maintain power. They would try to divide our movement along ethnic or religious lines. We prevented this by making the movement explicitly pan-ethnic and pan-religious. Our councils included people from all backgrounds. Our demands benefited all youth regardless of identity. Our leadership reflected our diversity. We made unity a core principle. When governments tried to create ethnic tensions within the movement, we responded immediately. We held joint events with youth from different groups. We emphasized our common struggles. We exposed government manipulation. We maintained unity through conscious effort. Another lesson was maintaining moral authority. Movements lost support when they became violent or corrupt. We committed to nonviolent action, except in self-defense. We maintained financial transparency. We held members accountable to high standards. We couldn't fight corruption by being corrupt ourselves. We established ethics committees in each country that investigated complaints against leaders. If leaders stole money or abused power, they were removed immediately. We enforced our standards strictly. This maintained trust and legitimacy. The movement's success inspired not just youth, but all Africans who wanted change. Parents saw their children organizing and joined. Workers saw youth courage and organized themselves. Farmers saw youth victories and demanded their own rights. The youth movement catalyzed broader transformation. In several countries, youth movements sparked general strikes. When youth protested, workers joined them. When youth occupied buildings, farmers blocked roads in solidarity. The youth movement became the spark that ignited broader resistance to corrupt governments. This was our strategy. We knew youth alone couldn't transform Africa. We needed to inspire and unite all oppressed people. By showing courage and winning victories, we gave others hope. We demonstrated that change was possible. We became the catalyst for broader movements. I recognized that this was just the beginning. We had won important victories in several countries. We had built strong organizations. We had inspired millions. But we hadn't yet achieved the total transformation Africa needed. The next phase required winning power in more countries. Youth movements needed to remove corrupt leaders in the 54 African countries still ruled by dictators or failed democracies. We needed to replace them with governments that served people, especially youth. We developed a continental strategy. We would support youth movements in each country with training, resources, and coordination. We would plan simultaneous actions across multiple countries to overwhelm old leaders' capacity to respond. We would build toward a continental wave of youth revolutions. The strategy was already working. By 2025, youth movements had helped remove corrupt leaders in 8 countries. They had won major concessions in 12 more. They were building toward revolution in another 14. The momentum was accelerating. We also needed to build continental unity. African youth faced similar problems everywhere: unemployment, bad education, corruption, lack of opportunity. We needed continental solutions, not just national ones. The Pan-African Youth Network was a start, but we needed stronger institutions. I proposed creating an African Youth Parliament with representatives from every country. This parliament would coordinate youth movements, share resources, develop common policies, and speak with one voice to continental institutions. It would give youth real power at the continental level. The parliament would push for continental programs addressing youth needs. An African youth employment program could create 23 million jobs across the continent. An African education initiative could ensure quality schooling for all young people. An African Youth Development Fund could finance youth businesses and cooperatives. These continental programs required continental resources. We would demand that African governments allocate 25% of budgets to youth programs. We would push for taxation of wealthy elites to fund youth development. We would insist on ending corruption that stole resources meant for young people. We would also demand that continental institutions like the African Union give youth real representation. Currently, the AU was controlled by old leaders who ignored youth. We wanted 40% of AU positions reserved for people under 35. We wanted youth to shape continental policy. The African Union had 54 member states but 0 youth in leadership positions. The average age of AU commissioners was 62 years, the chairperson was 68, the deputy chairperson was 64. These old leaders made decisions affecting 2,100 million Africans, of whom 1,218 million were under age 30. The majority of Africans had 0 representation in the institution claiming to represent Africa. We organized a continental campaign demanding AU reform. Youth movements from all 54 nations coordinated protests outside AU headquarters in Addis Ababa. We presented a petition with 12 million signatures demanding that 40% of all AU positions be reserved for people under 35. We insisted that youth shape policies on employment, education, and development. The old leaders resisted. They claimed youth lacked experience for continental leadership. They said the AU needed seasoned diplomats who understood complex international relations. They argued that youth representation would lower the quality of decision-making. They used every excuse to maintain their control. We responded by pointing to their failures. Under their leadership, youth unemployment had increased from 28% in 2000 to 38% in 2025. Education quality had declined across the continent. Infrastructure remained inadequate. Corruption had worsened. Their experience had produced only failure. We couldn't do worse, and we would certainly do better. We also demonstrated youth capability. Young leaders in Burkina Faso, Senegal, and Mali had delivered better results in 3 years than old leaders had in decades. We had reduced unemployment, built infrastructure, improved education, and ended corruption. We had proven our competence through action, not just words. The pressure built over months. Youth protests continued every week outside AU headquarters. Member states with youth-led governments pushed for reform internally. International media covered the campaign, embarrassing the AU. Finally, in late 2025, the AU agreed to reforms. The new AU charter required that 40% of all positions be filled by people under 35. The change applied to commissioners, directors, managers, and staff at all levels. It also applied to committees, working groups, and advisory bodies. Youth would have real power in shaping continental policy. The implementation began immediately. The AU appointed new commissioners for youth employment, education, and innovation, all under age 35. These young commissioners brought energy and fresh thinking. They consulted with youth movements across the 54 nations. They developed policies based on what young people actually needed, not what old leaders thought they needed. The Youth Employment Commissioner launched the Continental Youth Jobs Program with a budget of $4.5 million annually. The program provided training in construction, manufacturing, agriculture, and technology. It placed graduates in jobs across Africa. It aimed to create 5 million jobs annually, reducing youth unemployment from 38% to 25% within 5 years. Education budgets would increase from current average of 15% to 25% of national budgets. With combined budgets of $560 billion in the 40 countries, education spending would rise from $84 billion to $140 billion annually. The additional $56 billion would hire 1,400,000 new teachers, build 280,000 classrooms, and provide textbooks to 180 million students. Corruption would decrease through strict enforcement and accountability. Youth governments would arrest corrupt officials, recover stolen money, and implement transparent systems. Based on Burkina Faso's experience, where corruption decreased by 67% in 3 years, continental average could decrease by 60% over 5 years. This would save approximately $45 billion annually that currently disappeared through theft. The economic impact would be enormous. Young people working and educated would increase productivity massively. GDP growth would accelerate from 3% to 7% annually. By 2035, Africa's economy would be $5.6 trillion instead of $3.8 trillion under current trends. The calculation worked as follows. Starting from $2.8 trillion in 2025, growing at 3% annually reached $3.8 trillion by 2035. Growing at 7% annually reached $5.6 trillion by 2035. The difference was $1.8 trillion in additional economic output from youth-led development. This additional output would come from multiple sources. The 103,500,000 newly employed youth would produce approximately $620 billion in economic value annually. Better education would increase worker productivity by 15%, generating $420 billion in additional output. Reduced corruption would save $45 billion annually that could be invested productively. Infrastructure built by youth governments would reduce costs and increase efficiency, adding $315 billion in value. The total was $620 billion plus $420 billion plus $45 billion plus $315 billion equals $1.4 trillion in additional annual economic output by 2035. Compounded over 10 years, this produced the $1.8 trillion difference between the two scenarios. More importantly, young Africans would have dignity. They would build their own countries. They would govern themselves. They would prove to the world that Africans were capable of everything. The psychological transformation would be as important as the economic one. For too long, Africans had been told we were incapable. We were told we needed foreign experts to build our roads. We were told we needed foreign advisors to run our governments. We were told we needed foreign aid to survive. All of this was lies designed to justify foreign control and theft. By building our own infrastructure, governing ourselves effectively, and achieving prosperity through our own efforts, we would prove the lies wrong. We would demonstrate African capability to ourselves and the world. We would reclaim our dignity that colonialism had tried to destroy. The psychological impact would be especially strong for youth. They had grown up being told Africa was poor because Africans were incompetent or lazy. They had internalized these lies. They had believed something was wrong with them and their continent. Learning the truth, that Africa was poor because we were robbed, and that we could be prosperous if we controlled our own resources and governance, was liberating. This liberation would unleash enormous energy and creativity. Young Africans who had felt hopeless would feel empowered. They would start businesses, create innovations, build institutions, and solve problems. They would contribute their talents to development instead of wasting them in unemployment or emigration. The continent would benefit from the full potential of 1,218,000,000 young people. But if youth movements failed and old leaders maintained power, Africa would continue declining. Youth unemployment would increase to 45% by 2035. Education would keep deteriorating. Corruption would worsen. Young people would lose hope. Many would risk death trying to reach Europe. The continent would waste its greatest resource, its youth. The alternative scenario was grim but realistic if we failed. Without youth movements forcing change, old leaders would continue their corrupt, incompetent rule. They would keep stealing money meant for development. They would maintain systems that served elites while oppressing the majority. They would continue policies that generated unemployment and poverty. Youth unemployment would increase from 38% to 45% by 2035 as population grew faster than job creation. With youth labor force growing to 520 million by 2035, unemployment of 45% would mean 234 million young people without work. This was 130 million, 500,000 more unemployed than in the youth-led scenario. These millions would be desperate, angry, and potentially destabilizing. Education would deteriorate as old leaders continued underfunding it. Budgets would remain at 15% or decrease further. Teacher shortages would worsen. Classrooms would become more overcrowded. Quality would decline. Students would graduate without useful skills. The human capital needed for development wouldn't be built. Corruption would worsen as old leaders faced no accountability. They would steal more boldly. They would establish family dynasties. They would eliminate any remaining checks on their power. The theft would increase from current $75 billion annually to perhaps $120 billion by 2035. This stolen money would never reach schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. Young people would lose hope as they saw no path to better futures. Many would attempt to emigrate to Europe, risking death in the Mediterranean. Current emigration was 450,000 young Africans annually. This could increase to 2 million annually by 2035 as desperation grew. Africa would lose its best and brightest to emigration or death. The continent would waste its greatest resource, its youth. Instead of 1,218,000,000 young people building Africa, they would be unemployed, poorly educated, desperate, or emigrating. The demographic dividend that should have driven development would become a demographic disaster. Africa would remain poor despite abundant human and natural resources. The choice was clear. Youth movements had to succeed. The alternative was unacceptable. Every young African had a stake in this struggle. Every day of old leader rule cost us opportunities and futures. The urgency was absolute. The urgency was personal for every young African. If you were 20 years old in 2025, you would be 30 inches 2035. In the youth-led scenario, you would likely have a job, decent income, and hope for the future. In the old leader scenario, you would likely be unemployed, poor, and desperate. Your entire 20 seconds, the most important decade for establishing your life, would be wasted or spent struggling. If you had children, the difference would be even starker. In the youth-led scenario, your children would attend good schools with trained teachers and adequate resources. They would have opportunities you never had. In the old leader scenario, your children would attend failing schools and face even worse unemployment than you did. The cycle of poverty would continue. The stakes were existential. This wasn't about minor policy differences. This was about whether Africa would develop or decline, whether young people would have futures or waste their potential, whether the continent would finally achieve its promise or remain trapped in poverty and exploitation. We also recognized that success required building new types of leaders. The old generation had failed because they were corrupt, disconnected, and selfish. We needed young leaders who were honest, connected to communities, and committed to service. The old leadership model had produced disaster. Leaders entered politics to enrich themselves, not serve people. They stole public money to build private wealth. They made decisions based on personal benefit, not public good. They surrounded themselves with yes-men who told them what they wanted to hear. They became disconnected from the people they claimed to represent. This model guaranteed failure. Leaders who stole couldn't build. Leaders who thought only of themselves couldn't serve others. Leaders who were disconnected couldn't understand people's needs. Leaders who accepted no criticism couldn't learn from mistakes. The system produced corrupt, incompetent governance that impoverished nations. We needed a completely different model. Leaders had to be honest. They couldn't steal even when opportunities existed. They had to be connected. They had to listen to communities and understand their lives. They had to be committed to service. They had to prioritize public good over personal benefit. They had to be humble. They had to accept criticism and learn from mistakes. We created leadership development programs teaching these values. Young people learned that leadership was about service, not power. They learned to listen to communities, not dictate to them. They learned to live modestly, not enrich themselves. They learned to build institutions, not personal empires. The programs had specific curriculum. Participants studied African history to understand how colonialism and bad leadership had harmed the continent. They learned economics to understand how to build prosperity. They studied governance to understand how to manage public institutions effectively. They practiced community organizing to build connections with people. But the most important teaching was values. Participants learned through example and practice that leadership required integrity. They saw how corrupt leaders had destroyed countries. They understood that stealing public money was theft from the people. They committed to honesty even when dishonesty would be profitable. They learned that leadership required humility. They studied how arrogant leaders had made terrible decisions because they refused to listen. They practiced seeking input from diverse sources. They committed to accepting criticism and learning from mistakes instead of punishing critics. They learned that leadership required sacrifice. They understood that serving people sometimes meant personal cost. They saw how effective leaders lived modestly to demonstrate solidarity with those they served. They committed to prioritizing public good over personal comfort. The programs were rigorous. Candidates had to demonstrate commitment through years of organizing work. They had to show financial honesty. They had to prove they could work collectively. They had to earn the trust of their communities. Leadership was earned, not claimed. The rigor was necessary because leadership was too important to give to unqualified people. Bad leaders could destroy countries. Good leaders could transform them. We needed to ensure that only people with proven character and capability became leaders. Candidates typically spent 3 to 5 years in the programs. They started by organizing in their communities, building youth councils, recruiting members, running campaigns. This demonstrated their commitment and tested their organizing skills. Those who succeeded advanced to leadership training. The training included 6-month intensive courses covering history, economics, governance, and values. Participants lived communally during training, sharing simple accommodations and food. This built solidarity and demonstrated that they could live modestly. Those who complained about conditions or demanded special treatment were removed from the program. After training, candidates returned to their communities for 2 more years of organizing. They had to demonstrate that they could apply what they learned. They had to show continued financial honesty. Their finances were audited regularly. They had to prove they could work with others. They received feedback from community members and fellow organizers. The 2-year community organizing period was the most important part of leadership development. Training taught theory and skills, but organizing proved capability in real conditions. Candidates faced actual problems with limited resources. They dealt with difficult people and complex situations. They showed whether they could lead effectively or just talk well in classrooms. During these 2 years, candidates were assigned specific organizing targets. They had to recruit 200 new movement members in their communities. They had to organize 3 successful campaigns addressing local problems. They had to raise $50,000 from small donations. They had to train 20 other organizers in basic skills. These concrete targets measured their effectiveness objectively. The recruitment target tested their ability to communicate the movement's message and inspire people to join. Candidates who couldn't recruit 200 members weren't ready for leadership. If they couldn't convince people one-on-one to join the movement, they couldn't lead thousands. The recruitment test was fundamental. Candidates used various approaches to recruit. Some held community meetings explaining the movement's vision and achievements. Some went door-to-door talking to families about their problems and how organizing could solve them. Some organized social events where people learned about the movement while having fun. The methods varied, but the goal was the same: bring new people into the movement. Successful candidates recruited their 200 members within 18 months. They built networks of supporters who trusted them. They created momentum that attracted more people. They demonstrated the organizing skills essential for leadership. The ones who struggled to recruit revealed they weren't ready yet. The campaign target tested their ability to identify problems, develop solutions, and mobilize people for action. Candidates had to choose 3 issues affecting their communities and organize campaigns to address them. The campaigns had to achieve concrete results: winning policy changes, stopping harmful projects, or building something beneficial. One candidate in Ouagadougou organized a campaign to get a dangerous intersection repaired. The intersection had caused 23 accidents in 2 years, including 5 deaths. The government had ignored complaints. The candidate organized residents to document the accidents, petition the government, and protest at City Hall. After 3 months of pressure, the government repaired the intersection. Accidents dropped to 0. The campaign succeeded. Another candidate in a rural village organized farmers to demand fair prices for their crops. Middlemen were paying farmers $200 per ton for grain while selling it for $450 per ton in cities. The farmers were being robbed. The candidate organized them to sell directly to city buyers, eliminating middlemen. Farmers' incomes increased by 125%. The campaign succeeded. These campaigns demonstrated that candidates could identify real problems, develop practical solutions, and organize people to implement them. They showed leadership in action, not just in theory. The candidates who ran successful campaigns proved they were ready for larger responsibilities. The fundraising target tested their ability to build financial support from ordinary people. Candidates had to raise $50,000 from donations averaging less than $50 each. This required convincing at least 1,000 people to contribute. It proved they had broad support, not just a few wealthy backers. Candidates organized fundraising events like community dinners, concerts, and sports tournaments. They asked supporters to contribute monthly. They explained how donations funded organizing activities. They built sustainable funding from many small sources instead of depending on a few large donors. Successful candidates raised their $50,000 within the 2-year period. They built donor bases of 1,000, 200 to 1,000, 500 people contributing regularly. They created financial independence that would support their leadership. They proved they could mobilize resources, not just people. The training target tested their ability to develop other leaders. Candidates had to train 2-0 people in basic organizing skills like recruiting members, running meetings, managing money, and planning campaigns. This ensured they could multiply their impact by developing others instead of trying to do everything themselves. Candidates held training workshops teaching the skills they had learned. They mentored newer organizers through their first campaigns. They shared lessons from their own successes and failures. They built the next generation of leaders who would continue the movement's work. The training requirement also revealed candidates' attitudes toward power. Some people wanted to keep knowledge and skills to themselves to maintain their importance. These people failed the training target because they couldn't develop others. The movement didn't want leaders who hoarded power. We wanted leaders who shared it and multiplied it through others. Throughout the 2-year organizing period, candidates' finances were audited every 3 months. Auditors examined their bank accounts, donation records, and spending receipts. They verified that candidates weren't stealing money or accepting bribes. They ensured financial honesty that was essential for trusted leadership. The audits were thorough and unannounced. Auditors would show up and demand to see all financial records immediately. Candidates who couldn't produce records or whose records showed suspicious transactions failed the audit. They were removed from the leadership development program permanently. Financial dishonesty was unforgivable. Several candidates were caught and removed during audits. One had taken $3,000 from campaign funds for personal use. Another had accepted a $5,000 bribe from a local businessman to support his project. A third had inflated expense reports to pocket the difference. All were expelled immediately and banned from the movement. The enforcement was strict and public. The public enforcement sent a message that financial corruption would not be tolerated at any level. If candidates trying to become leaders were caught and punished, everyone knew that actual leaders would face even harsher consequences. The audits built a culture of honesty throughout the movement. Candidates also received regular feedback from community members and fellow organizers. Every 6 months, the movement surveyed 50 people who had worked with each candidate. The surveys asked whether the candidate listened to others, worked collaboratively, shared credit, accepted criticism, and treated everyone with respect. The feedback revealed candidates' character and working style. Some candidates were talented organizers but terrible collaborators. They took credit for others' work. They refused to listen to suggestions. They treated people badly. The feedback exposed these problems before candidates reached leadership positions where their behavior would cause more damage. Candidates who received negative feedback were required to address the problems. They met with mentors who helped them understand their issues and develop better approaches. They had 6 months to improve before the next feedback round. If feedback remained negative, they were removed from the program. Leadership required not just skills but also good character. The feedback process was confidential to encourage honesty. People giving feedback knew their names wouldn't be shared with candidates. This allowed them to be truthful without fearing retaliation. The confidentiality made the feedback accurate and useful. Only after completing all these steps were candidates considered for leadership positions. They had to have recruited 200 members, organized 3 successful campaigns, raised $50,000, trained 20 organizers, passed all financial audits, and received positive feedback. The requirements were demanding but necessary. Leadership was too important to give to unproven people. Even then, they had to be elected by movement members. No one was appointed to leadership. Everyone had to earn the trust and votes of the people they would serve. The movement held elections for all leadership positions every 2 years. Members voted for candidates they believed would serve them well. The elections were democratic and transparent. All members could vote. Candidates presented their qualifications and visions. Members asked questions and evaluated responses. Voting was by secret ballot to prevent intimidation. Results were counted publicly with observers from multiple candidates present. The process was fair and credible. Some candidates who completed the leadership development program lost elections. They had the skills and character for leadership, but members chose others they trusted more. This was healthy. It meant members exercised real power in choosing leaders. It prevented anyone from claiming entitlement to leadership positions. We also built accountability into leadership. Leaders had to report regularly to the movement. They could be recalled by members if they failed or became corrupt. They had term limits preventing them from staying in power too long. They faced consequences for betraying the movement. The accountability was strict and enforced. Leaders reported quarterly to movement assemblies where members could question them. The assemblies were open to all members. Leaders presented reports on what they had accomplished, what challenges they faced, and what they planned next. Members asked tough questions and demanded honest answers. If members weren't satisfied with answers, they could call recall votes. A recall required 60% of members to vote yes, but this happened several times when leaders failed to deliver or showed signs of corruption. The recall mechanism was real, not theoretical. Leaders who disappointed members lost their positions. In 2026, members recalled a regional coordinator who had failed to meet organizing targets. He had promised to recruit 5,000 new members but only recruited 1,200. He had promised to organize 20 campaigns but only organized 7. He made excuses instead of delivering results. Members voted 67% to recall him. He was removed immediately. In 2027, members recalled a financial manager who showed signs of corruption. She couldn't explain why expenses had increased by 40% while activities had only increased by 15%. Her financial records had suspicious gaps. She became defensive when questioned. Members voted 73% to recall her. An audit later found she had stolen $45,000. She was prosecuted and imprisoned. These recalls demonstrated that accountability was real. Leaders couldn't just ignore members or betray trust without consequences. The power to recall kept leaders focused on serving members instead of serving themselves. It made leadership a responsibility, not a privilege. Term limits were absolute. Leaders could serve maximum 2 terms of 4 years each in any position. After 8 years, they had to step down. They could later run for different positions, but they couldn't stay in the same role indefinitely. This prevented the power accumulation that had corrupted old leaders. The term limits forced regular leadership renewal. Every 4 years, at least half of leadership positions turned over as some leaders reached term limits. This brought fresh perspectives and prevented stagnation. It also created opportunities for newer leaders to advance. The movement stayed dynamic instead of becoming dominated by the same people forever. Some effective leaders wanted to continue beyond term limits. They argued they were doing good work and members wanted them to stay, but the rules were inflexible. No exceptions were allowed. The principle was more important than any individual, no matter how capable. Term limits protected the movement from personality cults and power concentration. Leaders who reached term limits often moved to different roles. A regional coordinator who completed 2 terms might run for national coordinator. A campaign director might run for financial manager. The movement didn't waste experienced leaders' talents, but it prevented them from dominating any single position indefinitely. Consequences for betrayal were severe. Leaders who stole were expelled from the movement, prosecuted criminally, and had their assets seized. Leaders who accepted bribes faced the same treatment. Leaders who made decisions benefiting themselves over the movement were removed and banned from future leadership. The movement enforced its standards without mercy. The severity was necessary because leadership betrayal damaged everyone. When a leader stole money, it was stolen from members who had donated. When a leader accepted bribes, it corrupted decisions affecting thousands. When a leader abused power, it betrayed everyone's trust. The harm was collective, so the consequences had to be harsh. In 2028, a district coordinator was caught accepting a $20,000 bribe from a construction company to award them a contract. The coordinator was immediately expelled, prosecuted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His assets worth $67,000 were seized and returned to the movement. The harsh treatment sent a message that corruption would destroy anyone who attempted it. The enforcement was public and deliberate. The movement announced each case of corruption and the punishment imposed. This transparency showed members that leaders were held accountable. It also deterred other leaders from considering corruption. Everyone knew the consequences were real and severe. This was revolutionary. In the old system, leaders were accountable to no one. They stayed in power for decades. They became corrupt without consequences. Our system made leaders servants of the movement, not masters of the people. The old system had produced leaders who treated government positions as personal property. They appointed family members to jobs. They awarded contracts to friends. They stole public money for private wealth. They stayed in power through rigged elections and violence. They served themselves, not the people. Our system was designed to prevent every one of these problems. Leaders couldn't appoint family because hiring was merit-based with independent review. They couldn't favor friends in contracts because procurement was transparent with competitive bidding. They couldn't steal because finances were audited constantly. They couldn't rig elections because voting was supervised by independent observers. They couldn't stay forever because term limits forced rotation. The contrast was stark and intentional. We wanted everyone to see that our leadership model was completely different from the old one. We wanted to demonstrate that different values and structures produce different results. We wanted to prove that leadership could serve people instead of exploiting them. The proof was visible in how leaders behaved. Old leaders lived in mansions while people lived in poverty. Our leaders lived modestly in normal houses. Old leaders drove luxury cars. Our leaders drove regular vehicles or used public transport. Old leaders sent their children to expensive foreign schools. Our leaders sent their children to local public schools. The lifestyle differences showed different values. Old leaders spent their time in offices giving orders. Our leaders spent time in communities listening to people. Old leaders made decisions based on what benefited them. Our leaders made decisions based on what benefited members. Old leaders feared criticism and punished critics. Our leaders welcomed criticism and learned from it. The behavioral differences showed different leadership models. The new leadership model was already producing results. Young leaders in Burkina Faso had delivered more in 3 years than old leaders had in 3 decades. They had reduced unemployment, improved education, ended corruption, and built infrastructure. They proved that different leadership produced different results. The specific results were measurable and impressive. Youth unemployment dropped from 43% to 28%, a 15 percentage point decrease in 3 years compared to a 10 percentage point increase under old leaders over the previous decade. The improvement was 25 percentage points better than the old trajectory. Young leaders had reversed a worsening trend and created improvement. Education spending increased from $340 million to $890 million, HAT, a 162% increase compared to 12% increase under old leaders over the previous decade. Young leaders had increased education investment 13.5 times faster than old leaders. The difference showed their priorities. Old leaders talked about valuing education but didn't fund it. Young leaders funded it massively. Corruption prosecutions increased from 3 annually to 67, proving that accountability was real, not rhetorical. Old leaders had prosecuted only their political enemies, not actual corruption. Young leaders prosecuted anyone who stole, including their own members. The 22-fold increase in prosecutions showed serious anti-corruption commitment. Infrastructure told the story most clearly. Under old leaders, Burkina Faso built 89 kilometers of paved roads in 10 years. Under young leaders, we built 1,200 kilometers in 3 years. The difference was 13.5 times faster construction. This wasn't because young leaders had more money, our budget was similar. It was because we didn't steal the money, and we organized efficiently. The infrastructure comparison was devastating for old leaders' reputation. They had claimed for decades that building roads was expensive and difficult. They had said limited budgets prevented construction. They had blamed foreign donors for not providing enough aid. All of these were lies covering their theft. Young leaders proved roads could be built quickly and affordably if leaders didn't steal. Other countries were adopting the model. In Senegal, Mali, and Togo, youth movements were training new leaders using our methods. They were building leadership pipelines that would provide honest, capable leaders for decades. They were ensuring that removing old leaders didn't just bring new faces doing old things. Senegal's youth movement had established a leadership academy modeled on ours. The academy enrolled 400 candidates annually in intensive training programs. Graduates spent 2 years organizing in communities before becoming eligible for leadership positions. By 2028, Senegal had 2,300 trained leaders ready to govern when the youth movement took power. Mali's youth movement had created a similar system with 300 candidates in training annually. They had trained 1,800 leaders by 2028. These leaders were already making impact in their communities through successful organizing campaigns. They were proving their capabilities before seeking formal leadership positions. Togo's youth movement had trained 1,200 leaders through their program. The leaders had organized campaigns that won policy changes in 45 cities. They had demonstrated that the leadership development model worked in their context. They were ready to govern when opportunity came. The replication proved that the model was transferable. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso or about me personally. It was about a system that worked anywhere it was implemented. The system had key elements: rigorous training, community organizing practice, financial auditing, feedback mechanisms, democratic elections, regular accountability, term limits, and harsh consequences for corruption. These elements worked together to produce honest, capable leadership. The continental impact would be enormous. If all 54 African nations adopted the model, we would have hundreds of thousands of trained, honest, capable young leaders ready to govern. We would have systems ensuring accountability and preventing corruption. We would have leadership that actually served people instead of exploiting them. I calculated the potential. If each of 54 countries trained 300 leaders annually, that would be 16,200 new leaders per year. Over 10 years, that would be 162,000 trained leaders. With term limits forcing regular rotation, these leaders would fill positions at local, regional, and national levels. They would transform governance across the entire continent. The 162,000 trained leaders would govern 1,400,000,000 people across Africa. They would manage combined budgets of $560 billion. They would make decisions affecting every aspect of life: education, healthcare, infrastructure, security, justice, and development. If they governed honestly and capably like young leaders in Burkina Faso had, the continental impact would be transformative. This was the foundation for the Africa we were building, an Africa led by people who earned leadership through service, who governed with integrity, who remained accountable to those they served, who prioritized public good over personal gain, who built institutions instead of personal empires. This Africa was possible. We were creating it leader by leader, country by country, across all 54 nations. The vision was clear and achievable. It required maintaining the leadership development systems that produced honest, capable leaders. It required enforcing accountability mechanisms that kept leaders focused on service. It required protecting democratic processes that gave people real power over their leaders. It required building institutions that would sustain good governance beyond any individual leader. We were building these systems systematically. Every youth movement in every country was establishing leadership academies, training programs, accountability mechanisms, and democratic structures. We were sharing best practices and learning from each other. We were creating a continental network of movements committed to transforming leadership. The network held annual conferences where movements shared experiences and coordinated strategies. The 2027 conference in Dakar had 890 participants from 34 countries. They discussed challenges in leadership development, solutions that had worked, and plans for expansion. They built solidarity that strengthened every movement. The movements also created online platforms for continuous communication. Leaders in training could ask questions and get advice from experienced leaders in other countries. Movements could warn each other about problems and share solutions immediately. The technology facilitated learning and coordination across borders. By 2029, the leadership transformation was visible across Africa. Countries with youth-led governments showed dramatic improvements in service delivery, infrastructure development, and corruption reduction. Countries still ruled by old leaders showed continued stagnation or decline. The contrast was clear. Leadership mattered enormously. Good leaders transformed countries, bad leaders destroyed them. The evidence was building support for youth movements everywhere. People in countries still ruled by old leaders saw what was possible under young leaders. They demanded change. They organized movements. They pressured old leaders to step aside. The wave of transformation was spreading and accelerating. This was the foundation for the Africa we were building, an Africa led by people who earned leadership through service, who governed with integrity, who remained accountable to those they served, who prioritized public good over personal gain. who built institutions instead of personal empires. This Africa was possible. We were creating it leader by leader, country by country, across all 54 nations. The transformation was spreading. The future was being built. Nothing could stop it.